April 11th, 1945. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood on the west bank of the Elbe River with binoculars pressed tight to his eyes, as if sheer focus could pull history toward him. He stared east, past the waterline and the thin haze of spring, toward a city every soldier in Europe could feel, even when they couldn't see it. Berlin. It was close enough to haunt the mind. About 50 miles. 50 miles of roads that, from where he stood, looked like they had been abandoned by the war itself. Simpson commanded the Ninth Army, nearly 300,000 men, disciplined, organized, and better supplied than any other American force on the continent. His troops had crossed the Elbe at multiple points and carved out solid bridgeheads on the far side. German units were collapsing in front of them like scaffolding kicked loose. Whole groups surrendered without argument. They dropped rifles, raised hands, and begged to be taken by Americans before Soviet troops arrived. The German army in the West was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to choose who would capture it. Simpson could read the moment with the calm instincts of a commander who had watched opportunity appear and vanish on battlefields for years. Berlin was not protected by a wall of steel or a belt of fresh divisions. The road wasn't clogged with tank traps or layered with pillboxes. It was asphalt. It was motion. It was the kind of opening you might never see again in a lifetime of war. He lowered the binoculars, reached for the field telephone, and called General Omar Bradley, the commander of the 12th Army Group. Simpson's voice was urgent, but held steady by discipline. The way a man speaks when he knows his words could decide thousands of lives. "We can be in Berlin within 24 hours, he said. "Request permission to advance." The line went quiet. Bradley, on the other end, was checking with Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Simpson watched his soldiers on the far bank tighten positions, throw bridges of logistics across the river, and prepare for what everyone assumed would be the final sprint. He waited as if the seconds themselves were marching toward the capital. Then Bradley came back on the line. His voice had changed. It was flat, almost weary, as if he were repeating something that still didn't feel real. "The answer is no. Hold at the Elbe. No further advance toward Berlin." For a moment, Simpson didn't speak, because he was certain he had misheard. His mind reached for a practical explanation. Supply delay, regrouping, a temporary pause. But Bradley's tone didn't belong to a pause. It belonged to an order carved in stone. "Sir," Simpson said carefully, "we are 50 miles away. The road is open. German resistance is collapsing. We can take the capital and end this war." Bradley did not bend. "Those are your orders, General. Halt at the Elbe. The Ninth Army will advance no further east." Simpson hung up and stared across the river again. But now the highway did not look like an invitation. It looked like a door that had been slammed while his hand was still on the handle. His army had been told not to slow down, not to wait for fuel, not to pause for reinforcements. It had been told to stop, completely. And he was not alone. Somewhere to the south, George S. Patton's Third Army, an army that seemed to run on momentum and audacity, was receiving the same command. Patton's men had fought across Germany in one of the most aggressive advances in military history. They were closer to Berlin than anyone had imagined possible. Now, Eisenhower had ordered them to halt and turn away, as if the capital were suddenly irrelevant. To understand why the order felt like madness, you have to understand how fast the Americans had been moving. After breaking out in the spring of 1945, Allied forces surged across Germany with astonishing speed. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating, not only in strength, but in spirit. It was a collapse you could feel in the air, like a structure that keeps standing only because no one has pushed it yet. Simpson's Ninth Army covered more than 200 miles in roughly 3 weeks. They bypassed strong points, ignored temptations to get bogged down, and drove hard to the east. It was mobile warfare at its sharpest, movement as a weapon, time as a blade. Patton, to the south, was just as relentless. His army crossed the Rhine with a speed that made planners nervous. He grabbed supplies wherever he could, kept divisions rolling, and treated hesitation like a disease. Every dawn brought another line on the map erased, another German formation shattered, another town waking under American boots. By early April, American forces were deep in Germany. The Ruhr was strangled and surrounded. German armies were being cut off and captured by the tens of thousands. The Nazi war machine was collapsing from the inside out, and everyone knew it. German commanders knew it. Hitler knew it. The soldiers on both sides knew it. The race was no longer to win the war. The race was to shape what the victory would look like. In the distance, Simpson's troops could hear Soviet artillery. Dull thunder beyond the horizon. The Red Army was closing on Berlin from the east, grinding forward through fanatical resistance. The Germans fought the Soviets with a fear that made them stubborn, because they understood what Soviet occupation might mean. The Americans heard the guns and realized something chilling. The race was close. On the 11th of April, Simpson reached the Elbe first. His army had beaten the Soviets to the last natural barrier before Berlin. All he needed was permission to continue, to cross, to finish the job. Instead, he was ordered to halt. And no one on that riverbank understood why. When Patton received the halt order, the reaction in his headquarters was immediate and explosive. He was driving east with his Third Army, and even from far to the south, he could sense the opening. Berlin was not just another objective. Berlin was the trophy that would define who ended the war in Europe. It was the symbol that would echo across decades. Patton had been arguing for weeks that the Allies should move for Berlin before the Soviets took it. He believed, more fiercely than most, that whoever captured the capital would influence the peace that followed. He saw the post-war world as a battlefield waiting to be drawn. He did not trust Stalin. He did not trust the idea that alliances would remain warm when the common enemy collapsed. So when Eisenhower's command came down, telling Patton to stop advancing east and pivot south, Patton saw something worse than military caution. He saw politics. "We're being stopped by politics," he told his officers, rage barely contained behind the tight language of a professional soldier. Ike is more worried about keeping Stalin calm than winning this war decisively. Patton was right that politics were involved. What he did not yet see was the full weight of what Eisenhower was reading behind closed doors. Briefings, reports, and intelligence assessments that painted a frightening picture. They described a German plan for a last stand in the mountains, a fortress in the Alps that could transform a collapsing Reich into a long, bloody nightmare. The name that hovered over those documents was ominous and simple: the National Redoubt. That, Allied intelligence claimed, was where the Nazi leadership planned to retreat when Berlin became untenable. A fortress complex in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps, a place where elite formations would dig in, where underground factories could keep producing weapons, where food and ammunition could be stockpiled for years. A final refuge where fanaticism and geography could combine into something no one wanted to fight. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been tracking rumors of such a redoubt since late 1944. The reports grew darker as the war entered its final months. Some described SS divisions withdrawing to prepared mountain positions. Others claimed concrete fortifications were being built into slopes, tunnels cut into rock, hidden depots seeded across valleys. The story sounded plausible because the Germans had defended mountains with skill before. Italy had been a long lesson in how terrain could turn even a dying enemy into a killer. Intelligence officers estimated that hundreds of thousands of German troops might be moving south to defend it. They spoke of a planned guerrilla war, an insurgency that could stretch on for months or years, with the Allies forced to bleed themselves out in narrow passes and jagged peaks. The idea was that even if Berlin fell, the Reich would not truly die. It would retreat into stone. Eisenhower studied these assessments carefully. He had carried the burden of Europe for years. He had seen how quickly German forces could turn desperation into counterattack. The Ardennes had proved that the enemy could still strike hard even late in the game. Every month the war continued meant more casualties. More mothers and wives learning the war was not done with them yet. The American public wanted the war finished. Congress wanted demobilization. Washington wanted the victory clean and decisive, not dragged into an endless mountain campaign. In Eisenhower's mind, Berlin was a symbol. The National Redoubt, if real, was a strategic threat. So he made a choice that seemed rational on paper and terrible to the men staring at the map. American armies would not race for Berlin. They would turn south and crush the redoubt before it became a new war. It was a reasonable decision if the redoubt existed. But the truth, buried beneath rumor and fear, was this: the redoubt was largely a myth. On the 12th of April, Eisenhower issued detailed instructions. Bradley's 12th Army Group would halt at the Elbe. Simpson's 9th Army would advance no farther toward Berlin. Patton's 3rd Army would pivot into Bavaria and Austria. Capture key cities. Secure the Alpine approaches. Prevent Hitler and his leadership from turning the mountains into a fortress. Patton read the orders and felt the war change shape beneath his boots. He could control an advance. He could control a battle. But he could not control being redirected away from the objective every soldier's instinct screamed for. He protested to Bradley with the blunt intensity that had always made him both effective and dangerous. Berlin matters, Patton insisted. The capital is what counts. Let me take my army to Berlin and end this war. Bradley understood the impulse. He even shared some of the frustration. But Bradley also carried Eisenhower's decision like a weight he could not throw down. Orders were orders. Patton had no choice. He turned south. Divisions that had been surging toward the east now swung like a massive armored door into Bavaria. The most aggressive American army in Europe was being sent to hunt a fortress that might not be there. To Eisenhower's defenders, there was another argument, and it came from diplomacy. 2 months earlier, at the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed on occupation zones for Germany. The lines were already drawn on maps by planners. Berlin lay deep in the Soviet zone, regardless of which army reached it first. Some staff officers argued that taking Berlin would cost American lives for a city they would have to hand over anyway. Why spill blood to seize a prize you would be ordered to surrender? But to Patton and others, that logic missed what symbols become. Capturing Berlin would give leverage. It would show strength. It would put American forces in position to witness the Soviet advance up close, to understand what was happening in Eastern Europe before it became sealed behind new borders. Even if the city was later handed over, the fact of taking it could change negotiations, change posture, change history. The debate did not matter. Eisenhower had decided. And decisions at that level do not feel like choices to the men who must obey them. They feel like fate. Along the Elbe, the halt order felt surreal. American soldiers cleaned weapons, brewed coffee, wrote letters home, and stared at the highway to Berlin like men watching a train they were forbidden to board. German refugees streamed westward, desperate, dragging carts and children and whatever fragments of life they could carry. They spoke of the Red Army like a storm coming over the horizon. They whispered about looting, about revenge, about violence. They said Soviet troops were liberators in name only, and that civilians were paying the price for what Germany had done in the East. An American lieutenant wrote home that they were close enough to end the war in days, yet they were sitting still, watching civilians flee toward their lines. His men asked why they were not moving. He had no answer. Across the water, the contrast was cruel. On the American side, the war felt like it was fading. On the far side, the horizon glowed at night from artillery. The sound of distant bombardment rolled over the river, and soldiers listened to it the way you listen to thunder when you know it is not weather. They could hear history being written in explosions, and they had been ordered not to participate. Some commanders allowed small reconnaissance patrols forward, testing the roads, feeling the emptiness, measuring the enemy. The reports came back the same. Resistance was thin. The path to Berlin was there, waiting. But the permission never came. Then, on the 16th of April, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the Soviet assault on Berlin. It was not a battle so much as a final convulsion of a continent at war. Millions of Soviet soldiers surged forward with thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of artillery pieces. The opening barrage was apocalyptic. Shells screamed into the city in a storm so dense it seemed to turn air into fire. From the Elbe, American troops heard the distant roar and understood the moment had passed. Even if Eisenhower changed his mind now, the Soviets were already between them and Berlin. The door that had once been open was now blocked by an Allies' army, and no one wanted the war's last chapter to become an accidental conflict between victors. By the 25th of April, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin completely. The city was encircled, the noose pulled tight. That same day, American and Soviet troops made official contact at the Elbe. Photographs would show smiles, handshakes, shared drinks, the clean image of Allied victory. The world would see comrades meeting in the middle and believed the story ended there. But officers on the American side saw other things. They saw systematic looting. They saw German civilians stripped of watches, food, anything worth carrying. They heard reports of violence against women at a scale that shocked even men hardened by war. They watched Soviet discipline collapse into revenge, and they realized something cold. The future was not going to be as friendly as the photographs suggested. At a meeting between commanders, conversation passed through translators, polite and celebratory. But beneath the surface, American officers were doing quiet calculations. They were counting the cost of Berlin, how many had died for it, how many more would die before it was done. One Soviet officer spoke of losses with an unblinking matter-of-factness that stunned his listeners. Tens of thousands killed, he implied, and that was acceptable. What mattered was that they took the city. American officers could not stop thinking about the roads they had watched from the Elbe, the empty asphalt, the surrendering German units, the opening that might have saved lives and perhaps changed the shape of the post-war world. They could not prove what might have happened. They could feel the weight of what had happened instead. While Berlin burned and the Red Army closed its grip, Patton's Third Army pushed into Bavaria and Austria, hunting the so-called National Redoubt. His soldiers drove into Alpine foothills expecting a fortress. They expected tunnels and bunkers, prepared defenses, a final SS stand that would make every valley a kill zone. Instead, they found surrender. German units gave up quickly. There were no massive concrete fortifications cut into mountainsides, no underground factories humming with production. no great depots stacked with supplies for years of resistance. The Alps were not a fortress. They were mountains, quiet except for the sound of American vehicles and boots. Patton's forces took Munich near the end of April with far less resistance than feared. They pushed on to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat, supposedly the heart of the redoubt. If any place was meant to be the command center of a final stand, it would be there. But Berchtesgaden fell quickly. The Eagle's Nest was not the nerve center of a mountain war. It was a symbol and a refuge, lightly held, a place for mythology more than strategy. Soldiers walked through the compound and took souvenirs like men wandering through a stage set after the show had ended. The truth hit with a strange emptiness. They had been chasing a shadow. Behind the redoubt story was not a real fortress, but a powerful deception. German propaganda and rumor had exploited Allied fear of a prolonged guerrilla war. Stories had been planted because they sounded believable. Radio chatter was interpreted through the lens of dread. Civilian gossip and scattered troop movements were stitched into a narrative that fit what commanders feared most. Some Allied analysts had doubted it, believed it absolutely. And Eisenhower, responsible for ending the war with the least blood possible, had made strategic decisions based on the intelligence he had. When Patton's staff confirmed the absence of a true redoubt, Patton's anger hardened into something colder, something like vindication mixed with bitterness. "The redoubt doesn't exist," he reported. "It was deception. We've been chasing a phantom while the Soviets took Berlin. But there was nothing to be done. The decision had already shaped the war's final weeks. Berlin was falling. The prize was claimed." History does not reverse because someone discovers the mistake in time to regret it. Berlin fell to the Soviets in early May of 1945, after savage street fighting and enormous casualties. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. But the ending did not feel clean. It felt like the beginning of something else. Along the Elbe, American soldiers who had listened to the artillery thunder for weeks stared into the distance and wondered what they had been denied. Could they have taken Berlin with fewer casualties? Would German defenders have surrendered to Americans rather than fight to the death against the Soviets? Would an American flag over the capital, even briefly, have changed the post-war settlement, or at least forced different negotiations? He cleared leaves so he wouldn't ignite his own hiding place. After Germany's surrender, Patton met Eisenhower in Frankfurt. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers celebrated. Flags flew. But Patton did not come with celebration in his voice. He came with a warning that would fracture what remained of their bond. He argued that confrontation with the Soviets was inevitable, that the Red Army was exhausted, that American forces were strong, and that if a clash was coming, the moment to act was when the balance still favored the West. Eisenhower rejected it immediately. The American public wanted peace. The government wanted demobilization. Truman wanted to manage a fragile relationship with Stalin. Patton's proposal was politically impossible, and, to many, morally unthinkable after years of bloodshed. Patton did not stop talking. He documented Soviet brutality. He warned about communist expansion. He predicted that Eastern Europe would vanish behind an iron boundary, that the confrontation Eisenhower tried to avoid would still come, only stretched across decades instead of fought in a single brutal season. His outspokenness made him vulnerable. Months later, controversial statements and growing political pressure ended his command. He was pushed aside, given a role that felt like exile. Then, in December of 1945, he was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim. Paralyzed, he died days later in a hospital in Heidelberg. He was buried in Luxembourg, Among the soldiers of the army, he had driven like a blade through Europe. Time did what it always does. It proved some fears justified and others impossible to measure. The Cold War came. The Iron Curtain hardened. Europe remained divided for nearly half a century. The border between East and West looked, in retrospect, like it had been drawn with a ruler on the Elbe. And that is why the halt order in April of 1945 still echoes. Not because it changed who won the war, Germany was already beaten, but because it changed the shape of what came next. It showed how diplomatic caution can override military opportunity, how intelligence can redirect strategy at the last possible moment, how agreements written in conference rooms can outweigh openings discovered by men standing on riverbanks with binoculars. 50 miles from Berlin, American soldiers sat still and listened to another army fight for a city they believed they could have reached in days. They watched refugees run from the east. They watched the horizon glow at night. They watched the future being decided beyond a line of water they were ordered not to cross. And decades later, historians would still return to that river and ask the same question the soldiers asked in whispers as they stared at the empty highway. Why did we stop when victory was right there?